Today I'm talking about one of my favorite kings, Vincent Kasuga, the king of the onion market. The world went a little crazy recently. People who have never dabbled in the stock market before suddenly found themselves a part of a global craze. A narrative began forming, that it was finally possible to beat the fat cats in Wall Street at their own game, and the hype was building. Whether you sat this out, watched from the sidelines, or joined in, it's easy to see why this really energized people. Unfortunately, many people who were joining in on this movement did not fully understand what a complicated mess the stock market is. So in the honor of manipulation, greed, and short selling, let's talk about onions. Vincent Kasuga was born in 1915 in New York. Vincent was an onion farmer. He owned a 5,000-acre plot and did okay for himself. Vincent wasn't satisfied with his modest income, though, and got into the futures market. Futures are an agreement to buy a commodity at a set-upon price at a later date. In Vincent's case, this was wheat, and regardless if the price goes up or down, the seller or buyer must stick to the original agreed-upon price. This can be a way of insulating yourself from market fluctuations, or in Vincent's case, a scheme to get rich. Well, Vincent bungled this and nearly went bankrupt in wheat futures. He had to borrow money from a friend, and his wife made him promise to never trade again. But that didn't stick. In the 1950s, Vincent began trading onion futures. Onions were very lucrative because of their wild price fluctuations. During harvest, prices would spike because of the demand and then quickly drop because all farmers would seize the opportunity and raise supply. Vincent's edge was that he had his own onion crop, so he could see how the current year's harvest was coming along. Vincent would buy futures at lows and sell them off during the initial high, often using unethical tactics. One year, Vincent noticed his crops were doing well, and therefore speculated others were too, so when the harvest would come, prices would drop and he'd be out a small fortune. To turn things in his favor, Vincent bribed an official at the Chicago Weather Office to issue a severe frost warning. This caused many to believe crops would fail and cause a supply shortage, and this drove up the price. Vincent made a good fortune off this. However, this is only the start of Vincent's shady dealings. In 1955, Vincent teamed up with his buddy, Sam Siegel. What Sam brought to the table was a cold storage facility in Chicago, large enough to house an enormous amount of onions. Throughout the year, Vincent and Sam proceeded to buy every onion they could, and by fall, owned 98% of the onions in Chicago. With nearly the entire onion supply in their possession, they were able to control the price of onions. Vincent and Sam were able to restrict supply and artificially raise the price of onions to $2.75 per 50-pound bag. Greed, though, has no limits, and Vincent and Sam came up with a devious plan to make even more money by short-selling onions. The two men were betting on the price going down, and since they controlled the whole supply, this was an easy bet. Vincent and Sam flooded the market with their enormous stockpile, and the price plummeted from $2.75 a bag to 10 cents. Onions had become less valuable than the bags they came in. Onion farmers in the region went bankrupt, having to dispose of millions of onions that were ultimately worthless. The Onion King had killed the industry and made out with millions. At the time, none of what Vincent did was a crime, so the government stepped in and passed the Onion Futures Act, banning the trading of futures on onions. But the real lesson here is that Vincent was reportedly a very generous and kind man to his community. He was known for his philanthropy. His hometown even voted him Citizen of the Year in 1987. But despite his supposedly kind nature, he had no problem bankrupting a bunch of farmers. I guess all is fair in love and war in the free market. It is every man for themselves. I admit, in regards to what happened with GameStop, I was roped in initially. I was seeing my absolute dream come to life. The rallying of the working class, putting aside their differences and coming together to take on the elite. Although I've always hated playing with risky stocks, seeing it as educated gambling, I was swept away, completely blinded to reality by a fear of missing out. The belief that a hedge fund would be backed into a corner and forced to pay each retail investor whatever amount they asked for is, well, it's a fantasy. I don't have much knowledge about the market. I don't understand a lot of what happened, and that speaks to just how uneven the playing field is. How in the world did anyone expect to beat Wall Street at their own game? A group of naive rookies taking on a veteran with unlimited tricks up their sleeve. I snapped out of my fantasy when I couldn't sort through the misinformation anymore. Was I falling victim to a pump and dump? Was I doing exactly what the hedge funds wanted me to do? It hit me that any money I lost was going back into the pockets of a veteran. I was giving money to the upper class, or a retail investor getting money off of me. I came out relatively unscathed. I knew I could lose it all, but I get so depressed seeing how many well-meaning people who just dreamed of a better life lost so much. We've heard over and over again that Wall Street is the perfect job for your everyday psychopath. Any money gained in the market is at the expense of someone losing money. There is no room for compassion or collectivism. It is everyone for themselves. Just you and a bunch of Vincents. There is no room for a people's movement in Wall Street. In hindsight, the very idea is absurd. A few retail investors made off very well, but many were blinded by the warm and fuzzies they felt being a part of something. I guess what I take from this is a reminder that change will not come from playing the games set up by those in power to maintain power. Change will only come when we push their game off the table and start our own.